Hey YouTube, Dawson Ryder here. Welcome to my series review for BoonBoomger. A bit late, but here we are finally. Usually I do community reactions at the very end of these videos, but starting with my last series review, which I believe was Gotchard, I separated that into a separate video. So I'll put a community post up and also leave your thoughts down below, and I'll use those as sources for comments for my I React Here BoonBoomger Takes video in probably a week or so, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know. Things have gotten pushed a little bit with the toys and everything, but it'll definitely be within the month. But let's go ahead and get started. Before we get into the positive and the positive and the mixed and the negative and the Megatrons, or whatever I just said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the early marketing in the suits, because the suits obviously put a lot of people off. I personally have really liked that we've been kind of experimental with the suits from Zenkaiger onwards, and was a little bit worried we would go really back to basics with this series. So even though a lot of the series was back to basics, and even before I knew it was going to be, I like that we didn't have back to basic suits and we had something that stood out. I'll admit, they definitely put me off a little bit at first too, but they've really grown on me, and I'm going to talk about the designs here in a minute. But I understand why it put people off, and I just wanted to say two things about this, which was the marketing and the perception, which I find it so disheartening and quite honestly frustrating that there's so many people that still hated on the series and refused to even watch it and called it terrible because of the suits. Like, I can understand watching a movie or show or whatever and it not being for you, but to be so superficial you couldn't even give it a chance, I think it's because one of my favorite things is when there is a series that doesn't look so good to me, whether it's for the suits or whatever, and it winds up being great, it's all the more rewarding and has me forming more of an attachment to it. So give it a chance, man. Open your minds, fans. But something else I wanted to talk about was, I think part of the reason I was more endeared to the suits is they had a really great marketing campaign for this, like with those really cool posters. The whole vibe and marketing for that was really neat. It had this kind of retro future-y feel. I don't even know how to describe it, but it got me really hyped for it. It got me endeared to the suits. I think it very much evoked the tone of the first lap, which was really great. And like I said, I do like the suits now. They're not a top 10, top 20 or anything like that, but I really appreciate them for what they are, especially since they kind of poke fun at it in the series, you know, call them the tire people and all that. I really love the power-ups, like 119's power-up is my favorite type of power-up, where they actually just evolve past the suit and it isn't just like a vest. But speaking of, despite the fact that I'm not a big fan of vest power-ups in Sentai, I love the jackets. It works so well, especially with them suiting up in the Grand Prix at the end. I still stand by that with the exception of the animal-based ones, the individual mecha are some of the most boring cars we've gotten for Sentai, but all the robots look great. So overall, I did like the designs for this series at the end of the day. But now let's get into some positives. So first things first, something I mentioned in almost every episode, I almost got tired of hearing me talking about it, is the stunts. The stunts and the fight scenes and everything was the best I've ever seen in any Sentai. Like, Sentai have had good stunts over the years, but I talked about this a lot in this series, that usually in Sentai, you have kind of your par for the course fights eventually. You start strong, but then you kind of have the rinse repeat. Not that they look bad, but it's just you've seen this fight 1,000 times, and then usually when you get a debut fight or a significant villain fight, that's when they pull out all the stops for something memorable. But every single fight in this series was memorable or acrobatic or made fun use of the powers, like the way the jackets worked. That was so cool. Like, King Odra had memorable fights because they used a lot of like slow motion, but this was just one step above, and I had to praise that. Like, even using clever stuff like the way that had the dumb tires on the back, which is the only thing I never got used to, but they used it in creative ways. Also, the score in this was excellent. I liked the theme song, but they had an excellent instrumental score. In particular that whoa, 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 whoa that popped up every time an epic moment of bonding happened. That was just really cool. I really loved that track in particular. They had a really great memorable score for this series. Also, I thought they had a great cast. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Joe, I felt he was like a very over-the-top, disingenuous feeling character. But just in general, the ensemble was a really good, solid Sentai cast where you could feel their chemistry and their bond, and then Sakito was over in the corner. But I really liked them as a group, especially that core three. I really liked that core three dynamic, and the fact that I can still remember what that felt like even when we got to the end of the series. I actually wish we had spent longer on that and maybe more slowly incorporated that, spent more time with a team of 4 and then team of 5. But they had a good cast that gave me that good Sentai chemistry feel. And that's been kind of missing a little bit. Like, we did have good casts in the past 3 years. We're missing that very classic Sentai dynamic of them just sitting around sharing a meal, you know, celebrating something. Because, you know, with Zenkaiger, they certainly had a bond, but 4 of them are robots. And Down Brothers, they didn't meet each other till the last episode. It wasn't quite that bad, but you know what I mean. King Odra definitely had a good cast dynamic and bond between the characters, but it was also very different than usual, which I applaud. I like to see differences. If Sentai is so repetitive, I like to see differences. But, you know, with that, you had the warring countries and all that stuff, so you never had that classic core Sentai, almost cozy feel of the characters coming together at the end of an episode and having curry or celebrating the New Year's, and I really liked that. And with the cast, like stuff like Taya really surprised me. All the stuff we were hearing about this series, back to basics, fun, more for the little kids, this was primed for your most elite, obnoxious Toku Red. And yet Taya was a cool character. He could still have silly moments or deliver, cheesy lines and stuff like that, or inspirational lines, but he actually was kind of cool and slick and sold this slick, almost spy vibe of the first episodes. Same thing with Mira. She very easily could have been your classic obnoxious Toku, female lead, but she also felt like a layered character. I think a lot of the human story was about her for a lot of it, about her taking the wheel, and that's another thing I liked in the series was it was maybe overdone sometimes. There's a couple episodes where they talked about taking the wheel too much, but that metaphor of taking the wheel and taking charge of your life, I think mostly worked as a running theme in the series. Also, I really did like some of the supporting characters. Loved the Inspector. I loved Boondario. Boondario was an endearing mascot character. I like Boondi as well. I wish that they had been around together more and had more stuff to do. Unfortunately, Boondi got shoved off to purgatory with Sakito, but Boondario was an excellent, endearing character, and I also loved the dynamic between him and the Inspector. I also liked the structure of this. There are some mixed feelings where I feel that sometimes it was a bit odd in the pacing in terms of the stop-start of the filler, but I liked structuring it around 4 laps, and even though some of the pacing was off, I did feel the series felt well planned. It didn't feel like there was a moment of rewrites or a sudden change of direction. It felt like it was all very concise, and I thought the pacing and structure of the 4-lap thing was really well done. I especially liked the feel of the first lap. Like I said, there was a lot of talk of back to basics, and I was waiting to be bored or annoyed with Gotchard, because Gotchard was back to basics writer, and it wound up being my worst nightmare. But this was back to basics in a lot of way, but in a good way where it made me nostalgic for aspects of Sentai that I really liked, and yet its first lap especially still had a unique feel. That was the thing about Gotchard was, I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, but it's an example where it felt like back to basics, and it was designed by a committee of all these cliches of what we had done in previous writer series. Whereas BoonBoomger had some of those classic moments, but it also felt like it had its own tone and style that set it apart that was actually really fun to watch in that first lap. So I really appreciated that it managed to stand out. Also, lap 3 was a high point. That thing was almost completely serialized, where from the start to the end, with the exception of the curry or ramen episode or whatever, it was really well done, where it had me locked in. I also think the series did a pretty good job of explaining the mythology about slowly unveiling where all the stuff came from and how Taya and Boondario met, the stuff about the Grand Prix. I think as we introduced characters like Sakito that came from space, or Genba that had experienced the oppression of the Hash aliens, they fleshed out a world you could picture out there of the Hash aliens and where all this comes from and the Grand Prix and all that. And I just really liked the unique way the BoonBoomgers came about too. It was kind of non-traditional for a Sentai. So going into the final arc, I talked about this a couple times throughout my reviews recently, but I really liked the unique structure of the final threat. It wasn't waves and waves of enemies. It wasn't a super duper big enemy that was hard to stop. It wasn't the villain coming and parking their throne in the middle of the city. It was them ruining the BoonBoomgers' reputation and kind of having them on the outskirts. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think the buildup of how Spindor and the Hash aliens take over planets was built up well enough, like I just talked about, that really felt like a unique structure to the end arc, which I really liked. And I liked the way the series ended overall too, with them going to the Grand Prix, finally getting to see it, and kind of the vibe of there will be more adventures. Now for the mixed aspects, I have 2 things. The primary thing is the crossovers. The only other mixed aspect is Genba's storyline in lap 3. I liked it. I liked that he was an alien. I liked that it gave him more depth. Like I said, it fleshed out the Hash alien threat too. But the mixed aspect comes in his weird motivations for being apart from the team. I did like that there were moments that there were members of the team separated, and Sakito always separated. It made the dynamic feel unique. And I liked the idea of him being separate for a certain reason, and I liked the way the dynamics played with that with Rokugo when that came in. But his reasoning was dumb. There could have been so many other reasons. He's like, I don't want to drag you into this fight. When literally the team's main mission is fighting the dude he's going after. It could have been something like, I go to dark places when I was going for revenge, I don't want you to see that. It could have been any number of things. It was just dumb. I didn't like that. But the mixed aspect mainly is the crossovers. You guys know how I would feel about that very often. I felt that this was kind of forced in. I didn't like the idea of you had to put the vehicle characters in there because they're vehicles, and then we found out it was to advertise their version of Zord Builder, which takes you out of it further. I think this could have worked better as a little Tokusatsu Net Club thing, whatever, on YouTube as a little short. I think it could have been fun. They could have advertised it, because it just kind of takes away from it, and it takes me out of it, especially the later ones, once we started using Sakito's mecha as literally a vehicle to advertise this, and then with Gokaiger, once I knew what it was for. I just wish they would have waited, especially since we were a year away from an anniversary series where mecha is so central to the gimmick. That would have been the perfect time to start this robot line and start shilling it out. With that being said, all the episodes they were in were solid. It was kind of nice to see Sosuke again. I have a bit of a soft spot for Goandru. That was a fun episode. I think the Tokyuger one was the most well done in terms of tying it into the story with the similarities of Rokugo storylines with Gemba, both being oranges that were aliens. Like, Wright's cameo was kind of forced, but I think if I remember right, he wasn't even supposed to be in it, but he wanted to be in it, so that kind of endeared me to him just showing up. And the Gokaiger one, they pretty cleverly tied it up of like, he's in space, he could bring this thing. They could have easily gotten the necklace 1,000 other ways without him there, but they cleverly tied that in. It was fun to see him. So that's the thing. I have mixed feelings on their inclusions, but all the episodes were solid. Now let's talk about some negatives. So let's go back to the laps for this. So lap 2 in particular felt like a really strange point in the series because we had two huge things debut, which was our 6 Ranger and Boon 119, and yet it felt like a whole filler lap. Like, it felt like those stories were almost an afterthought to fillers. It was cool that we spread out 119's debut story with him and his mecha through 3 episodes, but rather than it being a cool 3-part arc, it just was something that was happening in the middle of other episodes. Like, I think the first or second episode was in the middle of an investigation story with like Genba and Joe or something like that, and I was thinking, these should be separate because I'm enjoying this investigation story, but I wish that was its own thing, and Boon 119 should have been its own thing. That felt very weird. Same thing with the Sakito stuff. It just felt weird that it was such an eventful arc, and yet it felt so fillery to me. And then getting into Sakito's arc, I liked the idea of this sort of almost third-party gray area character, the cleaner, that might work with the heroes or villains. I didn't expect that to last the whole time, but they really fast-tracked it way too soon, and it felt odd for 2 reasons. Number 1, they fast-tracked him working with the team within like 3 or so episodes, and then the end of lap 2 had this big moment of him being like, now I realize I have friends. It felt like that would have been more satisfying if he would have been separate from the team, bringing a unique dynamic, and then finally worked with them at the end of lap 2. That wouldn't have been too long. You get him to work with them for the rest of the series, but it felt weird to have that resolution about finding friends and working with them when he already did that 5 episodes ago. And then it's made stranger by the fact that Sakito is very separate from the rest of the team for most of the series. He's in a handful of like dinner scenes or whatever, and he still feels like he's changed and he's bonded with them, but he's so often separate from the team, which I don't mind. I like having a different dynamic like that. But when they went out of their way to introduce him as a third party and then bring him into the fold, only for him to always feel so separate and so missing from so many big scenes, especially moments in the series like when Genba was separate and the team reunited and he just either wasn't there or he was in the corner. Like, I know he didn't have a jacket and a part in the champion thing, but I feel they could have done a lot better with his character, and it fell in line with a lot of my complaints about recent 6 Rangers, not all of them, but some of them. After they debut, they either become like just a gimmick, like a character in the Pokemon anime where it's like the future is now thanks to science, or they're just kind of left behind. It kind of reminded me of Dondor Goku in a way. Not in terms of the character, but it felt like Dondor Goku was often very forgotten about, although Sakito was in the series a lot. But you know what I mean. It felt like he was just kind of an afterthought in the series, and it's unfortunate because I like the actor, I like the concept of the character, I like his dynamic with Bundi. I overall really liked him, just wish he got more to do. Going back to pacing, I also didn't care for the pacing of lap 4. We had such a strong pacing for lap 3 that led right into lap 4, and then we went right into Fillerville for like 3 to 4 episodes until like that midway point where we got the Joe episode and then things went. It just felt so weird to slow down into such basic filler episodes. Not to mention the filler episodes felt like they were extremely basic ones that would have felt more at home in the early parts of the episode, or the early parts of the series, excuse me. And that's the thing too, is I felt a lot of BoonBoonger's more fillery, light episodes in the first couple laps felt more unique in tone and structure, and I felt as it went on, the filler got a lot more generic, par for the course. Just as 2 last little side notes before I get to my final negative, I wish there had been a little bit more explanations or flashbacks behind the plan of Chashiro faking his betrayal at the end. I thought that was poorly explained in a couple lines after it had lasted quite a while. And also, the last lap made me realize that I wish we had spent more time getting to know Spindor and maybe even Disgrace, because I'm like, this is not Disgrace, Grand Risk, because I'm like, these actually could have had potential for cool villains, and I wish they had been brought in earlier. And even though they kind of projected the threat of the Hash aliens out in space, I wish that Spindor and stuff had been brought in earlier to give the villains a bigger feel. I'm never a fan of that sort of roaming villain feel where you have a group of 3 henchmen that they get a new boss every now and then, but they're just kind of homeless. It makes it feel like it's not a threat there. But my last negative is I wish we would have seen the Grand Prix. It was built up as this unique plot element. Like, we brought it up so early on, I thought for sure we would see it. I think that would have made a really unique lap, or at least part of a lap, because they did have so many sequences in the early days where they would be doing a pre-Megazord fight that was like a race. They could have had like an interesting dynamic of villains that are involved in this. It could have been the Hash Aliens, maybe other players. There was just such potential for a really interesting lap, if not arc. I'm really glad we actually literally got to see it at the end, and you have this note of, like I said, there's going to be more adventures with this, and they're going to compete. And so that was satisfying to a degree, but I think it was a missed opportunity. Overall though, guys, I did enjoy myself with this series. I was very worried going in because I thought Sentai had made a lot of progress being innovative, especially with Dawn Brothers and King Ogers with stronger serialized writing, and the idea of going so back to basics felt like backpedaling. But also, when we had Gotchard going back to basics after Geats, I was not having a good experience with that. So like, all my alarms were set. And yet the marketing was pulling me in, and I was glad I was rewarded with a solid Sentai experience. I think that this isn't a show that moves the needle of like, oh my god, blew my mind, was so innovative like King Oger, but it wasn't a series that was like the most boring bottom basic Sentai experience that was tough to watch with filler and annoying characters and stuff. Like, it was a well-rounded, just kind of, I don't want to say middle of the road, like it's above average series I think, but it's that just kind of middle of the road Sentai experience where not every series is going to hit, not every series you're going to hate. Sometimes it's nice to have a classic Sentai experience over the year where sometimes you're really in it for an arc, sometimes you're like, oh, this will probably be a filler, but it's just fun to be there for the ups and downs and spend time with these characters. And it also did have a very classic Sentai feel that felt very kind of homey and comforting in a way. So it's a series that I personally did like, and if you didn't check it out, I encourage you to give it a shot because I think it's a fun one. Overall, I'd give the series a 3 out of 5. I think it's a very solid series. But that's just my thoughts. Like I said, leave your thoughts down below on the series, as well as possibly on the community post, but not both, I guess. And I'll pluck from that, I don't know why I said pluck, but I'll pick from that for the reacting to your takes video. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for all my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.